Bloodstream listeners, host Patrick here. This month, Bloodstream is re-releasing The Factor Revolution, our 3-episode documentary-styled series taking a look at hemophilia treatment from the 1950s through today. Well, at least through the beginning of 2017. As we know, there have been a few notable treatment updates since then, but the rich history of hemophilia treatment, including a period that some not so lightly refer to as the Hemophilia Holocaust, is as relevant today as ever. So I hope you enjoy this series. Please forgive moments where it may feel a little dated. And thank you to Bloodstream's presenting sponsor, Takeda, for making Bloodstream, including the Factor Revolution, possible. Visit bleedingdisorders.com for more on them, but only after you listen to and enjoy episode 1 of the Factor Revolution. BloodStream Media is proud to present the Factor Revolution, the last 60 years in hemophilia treatment.
Clotting factor came along in the 70s, the miracle drug that allowed us freedom to go to school and have jobs and build our own families.
On Tuesdays and Fridays, we would go to the doctor and he'd get Factor, and it made our life so wonderful. I mean, we just dealt with hemophilia. It wasn't an obstacle anymore.
With over 40 interviews from community members, doctors, and advocates, we take a deep look at the history of factor treatment from the 1950s through today.
What I think happened in the 80s was just a lot of disbelief at first.
We started hearing rumors about AIDS in the late 70s, early 80s.
I made a decision that I wasn't going to tell anybody I had hemophilia.
The Factor Revolution pulls together source material, news reports, white papers, and original audio content from the film Bad Blood and the HIV Story Project.
And today, with prophylaxis, these patients really they can live a normal life.
Vigilance really is one of the keys in that shared responsibility that we have as patients.
Our two lead producers on The Factor Revolution are Ryan Gielen, a filmmaker and writer and my co-founder at Believe, and Seth Kirshner, a writer and actor who community members will know from our web series Stop the Bleeding, where he plays Benny and writes some of the episodes. Say hi, guys.
Hi, I'm Seth, and this is The Sound of My Voice.
Hi, I'm Ryan, and this is The Sound of My Voice.
What's the style of the series? What should we be expecting here?
I think the best way to describe it is it's a documentary film for your ears.
A documentary about hemophilia?
About Factor, specifically, the bedrock of modern treatment.
We pull from over 40 interviews covering the last 60 years.
Meaning we do cover the contamination crisis. How did you handle that period?
Well, it's not easy. We say this a few times in the show. That period needs its own 10-part series.
Yeah, we want to always keep the lives and the lessons of that time close to our hearts. And we don't want to shy away from it.
Totally. The entire second episode focuses on the crisis and the aftermath. In 30 minutes, though, we don't have the space to go deep, but we wanted to give a sense of the scope of the crisis, the huge swath of lives that it touched.
And we collected a lot of source material for people who want to take a deeper look at the stories of that time. We linked to all of it in the show notes.
And what bookends that episode? What comes before and after?
This is the story of Factor. So we start around the time Factor is invented or discovered.
Well, Seth, if I may, we actually start at the dawn of recorded medical history.
Right.
When man first put pen to parchment to note a strange disease that seemed to affect the blood.
So, not the dawn of time. Like we don't start with dinosaurs?
I mean, unless you can show us some documentation on dinosaurs living with bleeding disorders.
I can't.
Well, then there we go. Then we start a little later than that, don't we?
2nd century AD, and then we zip very, very quickly through around 1900 years or so to the 1950s, and...
We should just start. Let's just start.
Want to?
Let's just start.
Thank
you, guys. Take it away.
Hemophilia is complicated, which means it's complicated to treat. And we didn't get good at it for a long time, like thousands of years.
Yeah, hemophilia was treated with witchcraft, leeches, by drinking blood, and all kinds of other deeply ineffective, even dangerous remedies.
Nothing worked, and nothing worked for thousands of years.
Like on a graph, there's just this flat line.
Nothing.
But in the last 60 years, with seeming lightning speed, real treatment emerged.
During this series, you'll hear it called a miracle compared to the Wright brothers discovering flight.
If we look at the imaginary treatment graph that I'm making up here, it's flat, 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 and then boom, it shoots up like a rocket from nothing. where the average lifespan in the United States for someone with hemophilia is like 10 to 13 years, to today, where the lifespan is basically identical to the general population in 60 years, in the blink of an eye.
In historical terms.
It's crazy how fast we got to today, after millennia of nothing. And what is this treatment? On par with miracles and flight? It's called Factor.
Now, community members know that today, in 2017, treatments are expanding beyond just Factor into experimental new territories, and we aren't going to ignore that. Actually, our entire third episode is focused on just the future of treatments.
But we're here to look at what really changed life for people with bleeding disorders. What started that boom on the treatment graph 60 years ago, and what's kept it going up, up, up.
The foundation of treatment that gave and continues to give people with hemophilia normalcy, freedom, and consistency is Factor.
And once the treatment revolution started, we got to Factor quickly.
But we didn't start there. We started in the 1950s with whole blood.
Lots and lots and lots of whole blood.
Prior to 1950, really the only thing that patients were treated with was whole blood. Hi, my name is Sue Garrity, and I am a nurse. I've been a registered nurse for over 40 years, and the majority of that time I have spent in the bleeding disorders community. That whole blood really only replaced the red blood cells that were lost during the bleed. So basically what was being done prior to the 1950s was really just keeping up with the blood loss that patients were experiencing.
So whole blood wasn't a solution. It was a way to bring patients back to a painful equilibrium. But it didn't ease the pain or stop the bleeding. It was just all we had.
When I was first diagnosed with hemophilia, it was 1955. Hi, my name is Randy Curtis. I currently serve as the president of the Hemophilia Council of California. My dad was stationed down in San Pedro in Southern California in the Army. They noticed that I was having lots of bruising under my armpits, which they thought was odd. They took me to the local hospital, which diagnosed me with hemophilia because they were throwing me up in the air and catching me. So I spent the rest of my life being worried over by people, afraid that I was going to have a bleeding problem. And I spent a lot of time in the hospital. That's how I grew up. So typically there would be a bleed and I'd be in pain and they would try and ice it down. And after a couple, 3 days, if it didn't resolve itself, I would have to go into the hospital and be in the hospital for a week getting plasma. So I spent most of my childhood, let's say 25% of my childhood in the hospital through grade school.
It was isolating, and everyone dealt with it differently. Randy chose to push back.
So I had braces on my elbows, braces on my ankles, and I went to school in a wheelchair. I was always kind of a in-your-face, yeah, I have hemophilia, what do you got kind of guy. One time when I was maybe in 5th or 6th grade, one of the guys referred to me as Crip. Hey, Crip. And then this was meant to be a derogatory phrase. And I didn't take it that way at all. It's like, okay. So I went home and I took my T-shirt and I drew a picture of a kid in a T-shirt with flames coming out of the back of the T-shirt, and across the top of it I put Crip Curtis on my T-shirt, and I wore that to school the next day. And that's the last time anybody ever called me Crip.
One of the reasons treatment was so isolating, cumbersome first-generation science.
We were giving the whole blood, so it did have the plasma, but if you think about, a child, you can't give a lot of units of blood to a child because it would overflow their systems. And that's all we really knew about at the time, was to give whole blood. And there was such a small amount of clotting factor in that plasma that the volume that you would have to give a substantial amount of factor VIII or factor IX was so large that we couldn't do it. We treated the symptoms of their bleed rather than treating their bleed to stop their bleed. That was kind of the whole start of treatment, but it wasn't very effective treatment.
In short, we just didn't have the ability to efficiently collect, screen, and deliver blood. And when it was delivered, it didn't do much.
Basically, it was just inefficient, and the payoff was minimal. But There was a step forward around this time, the early 1960s. Fresh frozen plasma.
Fresh frozen plasma was developed in World War II, and it became more widely available by the early 1950s.
This is Glenn Pierce.
It didn't work very well because the concentration of the clotting factors, factor 8 or factor 9, were very low in fresh frozen plasma. And so as a result, it would take a lot of fresh frozen plasma in order to control a bleeding episode. That would result in circulatory overload, congestive heart failure, so one was limited in being able to control bleeds. And for that reason, it wasn't particularly effective.
There really wasn't a lot of treatment out there. But then again, we didn't expect anything.
Randy Curtis again.
Craig McLaughlin tells a story of looking it up in an encyclopedia at his grandparents' house, and it says, hemophilia, average age of death is 13. It's like it was common knowledge that 13 was the number that we were all aiming for. The sad thing is that 75% of the people with hemophilia in the rest of the world still have that target number. By the grace of God, I'm here.
In 1958, the life expectancy was 27. With the advent of fresh frozen plasma, it did extend the life expectancy for these patients into their 30s. But on the other hand, these guys still had significant joint disease as a result of bleeding, because keep in mind, we're trying to stop a bleed that happened. We're not trying to prevent bleeds.
So progress is happening, but the results are not game-changing. That flat line on the graph for thousands of years has started to creep upwards. Treatment has taken a step forward with fresh frozen plasma, but life expectancy has not jumped much, in part because treatment is not preventative. It's only given in response to a bleed. And there's 8, 9, 10 years of this.
Until we get to right around 1964.
In 1964 was when Judith Graham Poole discovered that if she let the fresh frozen plasma thaw, the part that went to the bottom that settled out was the cryoprecipitate, and that actually contained factor 8.
Cryo was made from fresh frozen plasma, basically thawed a little, run through a centrifuge, which collects and concentrates the residue. I'm not going to try to explain it beyond that. I would butcher it, but cryo was a miracle in 2 ways.
The concentration of factor 8 in cryo meant people with hemophilia could use smaller amounts of product, and they could finally stop a bleed quickly.
It really revolutionized treatment for patients because it was a smaller amount. We could actually give enough of it to help stop a bleed. It didn't change the fact that the patient had to go to the hospital to receive the fresh frozen plasma, but at least they were able to get a treatment that would stop the actual bleed.
Because it had such a high amount of factor 8, when it was administered, it would stop a bleed just like that. So that was a miracle drug to individuals with hemophilia.
Life expectancy in the United States rises to 39.7 years of age.
So after thousands of years of around 10 to 13 years of life expectancy, in 20 years, we triple that.
Triple the life expectancy for people with hemophilia in 20 years.
The revolution is in full swing.
I was able to be treated on an outpatient basis with cryoprecipitate, which was kind of like this stuff in plasma bags that looked kind of like snot. It was like the gooey, gunky stuff at the bottom of the bag, which had historically, even one of my other doctor friends said, oh yeah, we used to throw that stuff out because it would mess up our experiments. And it wasn't until Dr. Poole came up with the idea that, hey, this might include some of the proteins that are needed for these kids with bleeding disorders.
Around this time, the doctors working with cryo also led the charge in the new concept of self-infusion.
By the time I was 14, I was giving my own infusions. I had a physician that was very forward-thinking and willing to trust the hemophilia patients to act as physicians on their own behalf. And with the idea that if we could get to the bleed earlier, we could stop the damage better than if we had to come into the hospital and be treated. But this was very radical thinking in those days.
A key component to a revolution is radical thinking, taking risks.
Yeah, having a vision for the future and then creating it.
So in the early 1970s, Dr. Murray Thielen, building on the developments of Dr. Poole and others, was one of the leaders in pulling the clotting factors from cryo, attempting to make them their own form of treatment.
Dr. Murray Thielen, who worked on the development of clotting factor, actually had hemophilia himself. This is the early 70s. Commercial clotting factor became available, and that really revolutionized hemophilia. People were able to treat their bleeds at home. They weren't spending days on end in the hospital.
That was the beginning of aggressive on-demand therapy. What then developed was the concept of prophylaxis. Let's prevent these bleeds from ever happening. Wouldn't that be much better for joint health, and wouldn't that prevent the occasional major accident that could risk mortality? Prophylaxis became the standard of care for children with hemophilia. Today, prophylaxis is used by increasing numbers of adults, and even though they may have joint damage, it will slow further progression of the joint damage and allow them to maintain a much more active lifestyle.
After a couple thousand years of nothing, in a span of 25 or so years, we've tripled the average lifespan of someone with hemophilia. It's the late 1970s now, and that number is growing. The lifespan keeps going up, up, up. And we get to factor, a more concentrated, distilled version of the useful part of cryo, the clotting factor 8 and factor 9. Now, this comes with all kinds of benefits: smaller vials and needles, less waste, easier infusions, more efficient and successful treatment windows that don't require hospital stays or even visits. You can see why factor is a huge breakthrough.
But that breakthrough is not the only reason why factor will come to define not only treatment, but the entire hemophilia community for decades. The breakthroughs, the positive advancements, are and remain a huge part of the story. But, like the treatments that came before, when you're dealing with blood, and donated blood especially, there are tremendous risks.
This was like a huge sea change in the way treatment was being given. I was doing all home treatment. I didn't have to worry about braces anymore. And my friends in school noticed this change. All of a sudden, Randy wasn't in a wheelchair anymore. They knew that I was a little more fragile than the rest of them, but I was, I was part of the group. I remember in like senior year of high school, maybe 1972, I got a little bit jaundiced. They kind of examined me and said, well, you already had Hep B and you've cleared that, but I'd gotten what they called non-A, non-B hepatitis, which subsequently became hepatitis C. So they figured that I'd gotten that from one of those clotting factor concentrates.
So doctors, families, and patients knew the donated blood they were using to treat hemophilia contained, in many cases, hepatitis A and B. It was a trade-off that extended the patient's life, so they went with it.
What they didn't know was that some blood contained hepatitis C, in part because they didn't even know hepatitis C existed. In fact, you'll hear it referred to often as Hep non-AB. Before they named it C, they just called it non-AB. That's how little they knew about it.
We know that the clotting factor does transmit some diseases, even before HIV. We knew that there was probably hepatitis B in the clotting factor. We also knew at the time hepatitis C was called non-A, non-B hepatitis, and we knew that that was in the clotting factors too. And it was such a revolution for these patients to have something they could treat with. It was kind of a risk versus benefit. At the time, no one really knew the ramifications of the non-A, non-B hepatitis that could be dormant for 30 years and then rear its ugly head, and the person would end up with liver disease and needing liver transplantation. We just didn't know.
Well, the way I was first became aware of factor concentrate was really in 1983. This is Dr. Dana Kuhn, and I am the president and founder of Patient Services Incorporated. We call it PSI. I had my first blood product-derived treatment for factor VIII. And that was due to an injury that I sustained playing basketball. I broke my foot and it swelled tremendously. And weeks, months prior to this injury, I heard that there was some kind of a treatment for people with hemophilia, but I never thought I would need it. Again, as I said, I'd try to treat most bumps, bruises, whatever, hematomas with ice, and usually they would subside in a day or two. But this was one time that I sustained an injury that really needed to be treated. Little did I know that it was contaminated with non-A, non-B, which they call hepatitis C now.
What we did not recognize at the time was that the pooled clotting factor concentrates were pooled from donors that numbered in the many, many thousands, 60,000, even 120,000 donors. Their plasma would go into these pools. And so if you had one individual in that donor pool of 120,000 that had a high amount of HIV, or for that matter, hepatitis viruses, they would contaminate the entire pool.
And that's exactly what happened. As HIV hit the country, the infection made its way into the donated blood supply and into the hemophilia community. Those of you who were around at that time will remember the chaos and confusion surrounding the discovery and early years of the HIV/AIDS crisis, independent of the hemophilia community. The nation was just blindsided and floundering in response.
For those who weren't born yet, an important key to understanding the social and political response to the outbreak is that HIV/AIDS was, for years, largely considered a quote-unquote gay disease. The nation was gripped by fear of the disease, and historical, long-standing fear of and bigotry toward the LGBT community just compounded the problem. The LGBT community still faces discrimination today, but this was a time when it was far worse.
Yeah, you could lose your job for being gay. Gay people were not allowed to marry. We're not allowed to serve openly in the military. We're openly called horrific names and openly marginalized in society.
I mean, we could do an entire series on that subject alone, and there are incredible resources available for better understanding of the LGBT community's fight for equal rights in the US. We'll link to a few of them in the program notes and on the website. For now, for this show, that context should be enough to understand or contextualize the times.
You know, we were part of the 4 H's, the homosexuals, Haitians, heroin users, and hemophiliacs. I remember Dr. Marion Kerper telling a group of people in Berkeley at an annual meeting of some sort in the Bay Area that yes, you know, AIDS is in the blood supply. Yes, most of, you know, basically all of you have been exposed to it, and that was kind of like that. The curtain came down then, and then all of a sudden, a lot of guys went into hiding. People started dying pretty soon after that.
So while Factor was starting to provide true normalcy, a normalcy in life that people with hemophilia had never experienced before, it was becoming apparent that the unseen, unknown threat of HIV was very real, and it was here, and it was going to kill people.
There was panic and confusion, and things happened from all accounts very, very quickly. In the next episode, we'll hear some of those accounts. We'll take a look at what happened and how.
We'll try to piece together a timeline.
And we'll introduce you to heroes who survived and heroes who did not.
One of those stories is the story of Ryan White, told by his mother, Jeannie White. This is a clip from our collaborator, the HIV Story Project, and their series of interviews with those affected by HIV/AIDS. It's an incredible project, and you can watch the interviews on their website and on their YouTube channel. We'll link to them in the show notes and on the website. Here's Jeannie White.
My son Ryan White was born in 1971 on December the 6th. He weighed 7 pounds 8 ounces and really skinny, but had the biggest feet. And he was circumcised. I didn't know anything about hemophilia at the time, but then they come back and said that, you know, they can't get him to stop bleeding. They put ointments and all kind of stitches and everything on him to try to get it to stop bleeding. finally, they transferred him to Methodist Hospital in Indianapolis, and that's where the hematologist told me that Ryan was a severe hemophiliac with less than 1% clotting, and said it was very serious. He told me that he'd never be able to play contact sports, and he'd never be able to have any surgeries. They said if he's ever in a car accident, the chances of him living will be 0. And now I want to tell you some good news. He said, we have this new drug that's not approved by the Food and Drug Administration yet, but with your permission, we'd like to give it to your son. He told me, he said, we feel like this drug will enable hemophiliacs to live almost a normal life. So I was like, oh my gosh, yes, you can, give him factor, And they said, it has to be given by IV. And I said, that's fine. To be told that your son has a severe condition, that most are crippled by the time they're 12 and don't have a long lifespan. I mean, I felt like this was a miracle drug for us.
The Factor Revolution is a BloodStream original produced by Believe Limited, written and produced by me, Ryan Gielen.
And me, Seth Kirshner.
Edited by Josh Davis and mixed by Michael Capuano at Icemen Sound.
A huge thank you to the HIV Story Project for sharing their extraordinary collection of interviews with us, and to Marilyn Ness for sharing her film Bad Blood with us. Please check out both works. They're a crucial piece of our shared history, whether you're in the bleeding disorders community or not.
And a huge thank you to Dana Kuhn, Randy Curtis, Sue Garrity, Mark Skinner, and Michelle Rice, all of whom participated in in-depth interviews with us for this series, sharing their expertise, wisdom, memories, and insights.
Finally, a sincere and grateful thank you to Shire, who makes this entire series possible. They also make the BloodStream podcast, our monthly 360-degree look at the bleeding disorders community, possible.
To subscribe to the BloodStream podcast, the community's first and only professionally produced and distributed podcast series, just visit www.bloodstreampod.com. You can listen to every episode right there on the website, or click on links to any of the top podcast hosting sites like Google Play or iTunes.
BloodStream and our other podcasts, Ask the Expert or the Powering Through podcast or Bloodline,
which is actually pretty similar to the Factor Revolution, so if you like this series, check out and subscribe to Bloodline.
Yep. All of them are available through your preferred podcasting app. So if you typically listen to podcasts via Downcast or the podcast app on your iPhone or through Stitcher, among others, you can add any of our shows right there in the app, just like any other podcast.
Instead of listing the citations for our research here, we'd like to direct you to our website, www.bloodstreampod.com/factor. where we've listed every research paper, website, newspaper article, and speaker that we cite throughout. Too many to name, but each is incredibly valuable, a good read, and worth checking out if you'd like to do a deeper dive.
You can connect with us on social media at facebook.com/BloodStream Media or on Twitter at twitter.com/BloodStreamInfo.
Please like, comment on, and share links to these episodes. We build everything we build here at Believe and at BloodStream Media because we think it's valuable to the community. So we're honored every time something we've produced is shared.
Happy listening.
Happy listening.
Thanks for listening. Thanks again to Takeda for the support, bleedingdisorders.com for more on them, and we'll be back soon with episode 2. Subscribe to BloodStream, say hi on social, and tell a friend we exist. Talk to you again soon.